Before we actually get into the book, what I was going to say is this is going to air on June 6th. And I know that you are very much a history guy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's apparent in the work that you've written, although that's not what you're currently doing, which we'll get into. But you were telling me you visited a World War II museum recently. And yeah, I think it'd be great to get into just the meaning behind D-Day because we always say, like, never forget. But I think a lot of people just remember, even myself at times, just the very basics of what went down. And, it'd be great to hear what D-Day means to you.
Yeah, it's really funny because I think lately I don't know that it's meant more or as much as it just rekindled some things. I've got kids, that are in college now, teens, and so we were just down in New Orleans and doing some research, and I brought my wife and my son there. We went to the World War II museum, and as you know, it's out in New Orleans because the landing crafts, the Higgins boats, were created in Louisiana. And so, that's, I guess, the flat bottom boats are what, brought it there. So my son was really interested in what's going around. He's taking a look at stuff, but I found, even though I've been there a couple of times, my wife and I were literally reading like each information bit, from one thing to another. And I just see my son, his eyes are rolling in the back of his head. Because we didn't realize just how many aspects of it. I mean, you think about World War II, you think about, okay, there's D-Day, but I think for whatever reason, a lot of people start thinking that it's from like 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and they don't realize that it was that much further, and how even when the Germans started, acquiring territories and advancing their movements. I mean, in the 1940s, there's like 90% of the American population that had just gotten over World War I that said, we're not doing this. This was isolationist. They're like, we've got our own little island. We are just going to stick to this. No more killing our boys. And it wasn't until actually the bombing of Pearl Harbor that sentiment changed. So, there for a while, I don't know that I firmly believe it, but it'd be kind of a curious alternate history. If we had never been bombed, what would it have taken for the American sentiment to have gotten on board to get involved with such a life costly war?
Mm-hmm.
So it was really interesting to see that. I think the other thing that's kind of come home close to us is my daughter, for spring break, went last year, I guess it was, went to France. And the guys that she was traveling with, they wanted to go to Normandy, and she was like, all right, what is that? It's a beach, it's a landing and stuff. I showed her that 10-minute scene of Saving Private Ryan, where, on the big screen, where it's just hell. And I think that it gave her just a full appreciation of that hallowed ground that she and her friends were walking on. And she came back having been to Utah, Omaha beaches. I think Gold they had gone to. I don't know if they hit Juneau or Sword, but I mean, because that whole area stretches like what, 50, 60 miles of coastline that was fortified. So I think, here in the house, we've had a lot of discussion of what that was, what it meant, and when there is that call to war, how we think you're all in, but when you start thinking about how over a period of time, you send 200,000 men almost to land on a beach. I mean, it's just the numbers are just staggering.
Yeah, it really is. And I think people worry are these lessons going to be taught for the next generations? I mean, I've mentioned before on the show, like we had actually Vincent Speranza, a World War II survivor, on the show recently, who's still fully intact. I mean, he speaks like someone who's my age or your age.
Yeah.
He's completely all there, to put it that way. And yeah, we're losing them. I mean, there's only going to be so many Holocaust survivors the next few years. We're losing them. We're losing World War II survivors. I think the last of like the Pearl Harbor survivors, I had the privilege of interviewing one of them a while back, and it's important that your children and their children learn this stuff.
Yeah, I think my dad had a cousin who was World War II veteran. He was a Marine, fought in the islands. And if you can imagine, I mean, I'm stereotyping typical and pushing this down, but saying, you know, a lot of Asians at the time even were less than 5'10" fighting. This guy was like 6'7", and he was hand-to-hand combat in the trenches, in foxholes. And I remember when I was looking to join ROTC as in college, you know, graduating high school, and he was just really, he never talked about war, but I remember him sitting down with me one night and just trying to convince me so much not to look at the military as an option. And based on his experiences, I mean, he was so impacted by that. I remember that hearing stories from my dad that when they delivered the Purple Hearts, he turned them away.
Oh, wow.
He's like, I want nothing to do with this anymore, because he said, you know, you're giving me an award for something. We were just surviving. And so I can't even imagine, you know, what they were going through at the time.
Yeah, there's definitely a difference, I think, in terms of the attitude of that generation of military and this generation of military. Part of it has to do with the voluntary aspect of it, of course, but there's no shortage of GWAT veterans who want to come on this show, for example, and tell their story. And a lot of Vietnam veterans, for whatever reason, for differences in the culture, they're usually not as open to telling it, or they're not going to tell as much in detail. And I think especially the World War II guys, they got home and didn't talk about it. And there was definitely no such thing as going to therapy unless you had like unless you were like clinically insane or something. It's just not what people did at the time. So I think the idea of like opening up and writing a book, it's almost foreign to them.
Yeah, it's crazy. I was thinking, I was thinking back, even, you know, as I mentioned the ROTC, I remember right before, you know, I was ready to sign contract, and this guy, Sergeant Major Jones, part of the cadre, you know, and he and I were talking about it, and he was, you know, we were talking about the looming Gulf Wars, and he was like, you know, he goes, we train to fight in jungles after Vietnam. He's like, people are going out to the desert, and he says, there's no tree to hide behind in the desert.
Yeah.
And I can just imagine what these guys in World War II were thinking when, as they're coming across in these boats, you know, choppy seas, you know, how are we going to do it? And they just see these massive berms and saying, you know, these guys are just going to be cutting us down. But we're supposed to take the hill. How exactly is that going to be done? Because ultimately, how could any of them ever thought to have even trained like they were going to have to fight? It's and in really what amounted to just a massive surge of attrition to just see who can break through those lines at human cost. It's unbelievable.